So, the breaking news tonight is that Buckingham Palace has finally officially confirmed what half of elite London has been nervously whispering about for weeks. King Charles is officially stepping back from his grueling public duties, and the absolute power inside the palace is rapidly, undeniably shifting directly to Prince William and Catherine. But, incredibly, that is absolutely not the specific part of the massive announcement that has absolutely everyone talking. The real, explosive story is the single, handwritten sentence buried quietly at the very bottom of the official succession order. A highly specific sentence that effectively, legally shut Queen Camilla completely out of the monarchy's vital decision-making process. And from absolutely everything we are reliably hearing from insiders, she didn't see the brutal maneuver coming until the heavy document was already signed, sealed, and legally binding. If you've been paying close attention to the royal family recently, you intimately know that King Charles has been desperately trying to project this flawless image of absolute stability for months. We repeatedly saw the incredibly carefully staged, brightly lit photos of him diligently working at his desk. We read the endless palace statements, fiercely insisting that he was easily keeping up with his daily red boxes of state papers. We heard the constant soothing assurances that his ongoing cancer treatment absolutely wasn't slowing his pace down. But behind the heavy velvet curtains, the grim reality was incredibly different. Important meetings were quietly canceled at the last minute, lengthy ceremonies were abruptly shortened, and Prince William was quietly, steadily absorbing significantly more and more of the king's exhausting public schedule. What we are definitively learning now is that the absolute breaking point happened completely out of public view during a private rehearsal for a massive state ceremony in London. Charles stubbornly showed up, fiercely determined to push through it, but terrified witnesses say he physically, undeniably couldn't keep up the pace. The color completely drained out of his face, his usually sharp answers got noticeably shorter and confused, and his mental focus visibly drifted. Eventually, the large room had to be hastily cleared by security, and his personal doctors were urgently called in. Their medical message to the monarch was absolutely blunt. If he didn't immediately stop stubbornly pushing himself past his physical limits, he was going to catastrophically undo absolutely all the fragile medical progress he had made. He desperately needed to formally surrender the vast majority of his exhausting responsibilities immediately and actively prepare for a significantly longer public absence than absolutely anyone had publicly admitted or planned for. That stark medical reality led directly to an unprecedented emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace. Prince William, for way too long, please do not just watch this story in silence. Like this video and actively subscribe to our channel so you absolutely don't miss exactly what happens next, because this massive power struggle is incredibly far from over. So, picture the scene. They were sitting around this massive polished table, and there is exactly one sealed folder resting in the center. The printed title on it is stark and simple: The Royal Continuity and Succession Order. At first, William naturally assumes it's just administrative paperwork about delegating a few upcoming, canceled engagements. Catherine logically thinks it's merely a temporary, minor schedule adjustment. But then Charles slowly opens the heavy document and explicitly explains exactly what it actually legally does. It formally transfers control of all vital state audiences, absolutely all senior palace appointments, massive ceremonial planning, and the entire long-term strategic direction of the monarchy directly to Prince William. And then the king turns specifically to Catherine. Under this new, sweeping order, she would immediately assume the massive, highly visible responsibilities normally expected of the reigning queen consort: state banquets, massive diplomatic receptions, and the entire royal household's grueling public program. Basically, all the highly visible vital duties that clearly tell Britain and the entire Commonwealth exactly who is actually at the center of royal life right now. Catherine didn't respond right away, and honestly, I completely get her hesitation. Formally accepting a massive role like that instantly changes exactly how absolutely every single future public appearance is interpreted by the press. It's one thing to dutifully support your husband as the heir. It's an entirely different, massive thing to officially step into a position that makes you look exactly like you are already functioning as the queen-in-waiting while the king is still alive. William forcefully pushed back against the plan, too. He bluntly told Charles that the cynical public and hostile press might easily think he actively forced this sudden transition, that it would look exactly like ruthless ambition rather than sad medical necessity. But Charles was incredibly clear and unyielding. He firmly stated the difficult decision was entirely his own, and that fiercely protecting the survival of the monarchy couldn't possibly mean foolishly pretending his physical strength hadn't drastically changed. He was actively, deliberately trying to shield them from the inevitable public blame. But here is exactly where the meeting gets incredibly weird and highly conspiratorial. Before the discussion could continue any further, Princess Anne silently reached into her bag and placed a second, entirely different folder directly on the table. Inside were highly confidential, leaked notes originating from senior members of Queen Camilla's own private household. These absolutely weren't just casual, speculative emails. They were highly detailed, actionable plans. Meticulous plans for exactly how Camilla could aggressively preserve her own authority if Charles was forced to withdraw, exactly how her private office could ruthlessly retain influence over massive ceremonies, key appointments, and the palace program, and exactly how William's new, sweeping control could be deliberately treated by staff as merely temporary, even if Charles ultimately remained away for many months or years. William read the explosive first page twice in disbelief. Catherine stayed completely, perfectly still. The terrifying implications of the document were impossible to ignore. While Charles was physically struggling just to maintain his basic duties, Camilla's ambitious household was already actively, secretly discussing exactly how to keep royal power firmly in her hands, and absolutely neither William nor Catherine had been invited into those crucial conversations. Charles absolutely hadn't approved these plans, and Anne had somehow found them before the silent coup could go absolutely any further. The language used in those leaked notes was incredibly careful and bureaucratic. Absolutely nobody explicitly used the preparing for Charles's prolonged absence, long before William was even told exactly how serious that absence might actually become. The leaked proposal confidently described a new advisory arrangement firmly based at Clarence House. It would legally allow Camilla's office to formally review all ceremonial plans, directly recommend major changes to the royal diary, and stay heavily involved in controlling state banquets and major public appearances. One specific chilling paragraph actually suggested that William's newly expanded authority should deliberately be described to the public and staff as temporary, even if Charles stayed away indefinitely. That single arrogant sentence completely changed the entire atmosphere of the room. William furiously asked exactly who wrote it. Anne silently turned to another page and pointed directly to a printed list of names, senior members of Camilla's own office, her top private secretaries, and her closest household advisors. Charles read the names in complete, stunned silence. He absolutely hadn't approved the meeting that generated these notes. He absolutely hadn't requested the proposal, and he definitely hadn't been told that his wife's household was already actively discussing exactly how to preserve their own influence after he stepped back from power. Catherine's sharp attention moved quickly to the margins of the document. There were specific, handwritten comments scribbled next to the proposals. One comment strongly recommended that all major ceremonial decisions should strictly require formal consultation with the Queen's office. Another explicitly warned against allowing Kensington Palace to become the absolute only center of authority during the King's recovery. The underlying message beneath absolutely all that polite bureaucratic wording was entirely unmistakable. William could do the exhausting heavy lifting and carry the physical burden, but Camilla fully intended to keep a firm hand on the institutional controls. Anne quietly explained that the damning papers had reached her only after a senior aide in Camilla's camp became deeply uneasy about the power grab. The concern in the documents was cleverly framed as maintaining continuity, stability, and experience. Palace language can easily make almost absolutely anything sound harmless and necessary, but Charles forcefully closed the folder and asked the exact, terrifying question absolutely everyone was thinking. Did Camilla know about this? Anne carefully said the extensive discussions had definitively taken place throughout her household, but the specific documents didn't explicitly show exactly how much Camilla had personally, formally approved. William looked fiercely toward the heavy door, clearly ready to confront her right there in the hallway. Charles immediately stopped him. He firmly said this massive crisis couldn't possibly become a messy corridor confrontation, not with hundreds of staff constantly moving through the palace and hungry reporters aggressively watching absolutely every single change in the royal schedule. Camilla would be summoned entirely privately and given one chance to explain herself. The intense meeting broke for 20 agonizing minutes. William walked into an adjoining room overlooking the gardens. His initial hot anger absolutely hadn't gone away. It had simply settled into something significantly colder and more calculated. Catherine quietly followed him and astutely reminded him that the leaked papers were incredibly dangerous, specifically because they looked so bureaucratic and reasonable. A loud, public accusation would easily allow Camilla's savvy office to completely deny everything and successfully paint William to the press as a greedy heir impatient for the crown. He deeply understood that, and it made the betrayal feel infinitely worse. When Camilla finally entered the room, Charles was rigidly seated at the head of the long table and deliberately kept the folder closed. William stood tensely near the fireplace. Catherine sat perfectly composed directly opposite the empty chair prepared for Camilla. Absolutely nobody raised their voice. The heavy, suffocating silence did more than enough. Charles asked her incredibly directly whether her household had actively discussed creating an advisory council operating from Clarence House after his medical withdrawal. Camilla paused briefly and carefully said that responsible staff had merely considered several remote possibilities. She smoothly described it as prudent preparation, absolutely not ambition. She fiercely argued that a massive monarchy facing unprecedented medical uncertainty simply couldn't afford to casually discard her vast experience. She had stoically stood beside Charles through long years of intense public pressure. She intimately understood the complex diplomatic calendar, the intricate ceremonial machinery, and the notoriously difficult personalities inside the royal household. Removing her office completely from absolutely every important decision wouldn't create stability, she argued. It would create massive, dangerous disruption. Then, she boldly made her request. The official succession order should be immediately amended. She proposed a formal, recognized position, legally allowing her to retain significant influence over major state banquets, key ceremonial appointments, massive charitable patronages, and the overall public program. In her plan, William would manage the boring, day-to-day constitutional business. Catherine could look pretty and represent the crown beside him, but Camilla's seasoned household would remain heavily involved whenever ancient tradition, protocol, or the king's personal interests were concerned. It sounded exactly like a reasonable compromise. It absolutely wasn't. Catherine, who had been silent, asked exactly one piercing question. Who, exactly, would make the absolute final decision when William and Camilla inevitably disagreed? Camilla answered smoothly that Charles's own wishes should always guide them, but that was the massive, glaring problem. Charles's physical and mental absence was the entire, absolute reason this new arrangement existed in the first place. Yet Camilla's self-serving proposal still heavily depended on him exhausting himself settling their petty disputes from his private sickbed while he was supposed to be recovering. The immense burden would immediately come right back to him through endless phone calls, competing, confusing instructions, and desperate appeals for his intervention. Anne silently opened the folder and slid one specific page directly toward Charles. It explicitly described William's new authority as reversible. That single arrogant word ended the discussion completely. Charles firmly told Camilla that absolutely no amendment would be made that created a rival court or weakened the heir's absolute authority. Camilla's confident expression instantly changed. She turned sharply to William and asked, her voice cold, if this was exactly what he wanted. William answered evenly that he absolutely hadn't written the order. Charles had. Camilla stood up and left the room without ever explicitly accepting the king's decision. The heavy door closed very softly behind her, but absolutely nobody in that room mistook her icy calm for total surrender. Charles then turned and asked the constitutional advisor the terrifying question absolutely everyone had been avoiding. Could Camilla's powerful household actively challenge the order after it was legally signed? The advisor looked grimly at the final page and said there was exactly one way to make absolutely sure they never could. He explained that a massive transfer of duties could be subtly challenged through endless interpretation. Her household might falsely claim consultation rights, a loyal aide might deliberately delay a key appointment, a disputed instruction could be endlessly returned for clarification. Absolutely none of those subtle, bureaucratic moves would legally overturn William's authority, but each and every one could significantly slow it down, publicly weaken it, and cruelly force the sick king right back into the exact power struggle he was desperately trying to escape. Charles deeply understood that this was absolutely no longer just about whether William could physically carry the heavy workload. It was about whether absolutely anyone would be allowed to deliberately obstruct him while falsely pretending to protect the crown. William moved slowly away from the fireplace and sat directly opposite his father. He told Charles firmly that he absolutely wouldn't accept massive authority built entirely on public humiliation. He wouldn't comfortably appear before the entire country exactly as though his father's tragic illness had become a cynical opportunity for a power grab. If the massive announcement went forward, it absolutely had to preserve the king's total dignity. Charles nodded slowly. Stepping aside absolutely wasn't surrender, he said firmly. It was a brave choice made long before physical weakness allowed greedy others to choose for him. Catherine astutely asked exactly how the massive transition would be presented to the public. Her primary concern was absolute clarity. The country absolutely couldn't be shown one neat arrangement on television while the palace secretly operated under a chaotic, entirely different one behind closed doors. If William was fully expected to lead the institution, the public program had to flawlessly reflect it. If Catherine was fully expected to assume the Queen's massive visible duties, absolutely no private office could quietly, maliciously revise her decisions. Anne watched Charles incredibly closely. He had spent his entire life exhaustingly balancing deep affection, rigid duty, massive history, and profound guilt. Now, absolutely every attempted compromise led directly back to the exact same massive problem. Camilla desperately wanted public recognition for standing beside him. William desperately needed absolute, unquestioned authority as the heir. Catherine desperately needed ironclad protection from malicious accusations that she had ruthlessly taken something that was absolutely not hers. The massive monarchy desperately needed exactly one clear voice. Only exactly one of those competing needs could ultimately govern the order. The advisors immediately began furiously revising the document. Dangerous clauses vaguely granting consultation rights to the Queen's household were entirely removed. All state audiences would pass directly and exclusively to William. Absolutely all senior palace appointments would strictly require his personal approval. Long-term strategic planning would move entirely under his office's control. Catherine would completely oversee massive state banquets, all diplomatic receptions, key ceremonial presentation, and the entire public program attached to the royal household. Anne would remain the steady bridge, absolutely not the ruler, absolutely not the rival, simply the unshakable witness. For nearly an agonizing hour, Charles read absolutely every single revised line. He anxiously asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then stretched into months, then significantly longer than anyone expected. The advisor's answers became significantly less comfortable each time he asked. A temporary arrangement absolutely couldn't remain temporary forever, simply because absolutely no one wished to say the hard words about what came next. The crown absolutely couldn't live indefinitely inside a pause. Charles finally reached the final page. The signature line waited patiently beneath the massive royal seal. Directly beside it lay the antique fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William fully expected him to sign it. Catherine fully expected yet another agonizing delay. Anne acutely noticed his hand move deliberately away from the signature line and directly toward the blank space immediately below the last clause. He began to write incredibly slowly. No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the Queen's household. That one, handwritten sentence changed absolutely everything. William read it once, then read it again in disbelief. The order was absolutely no longer just a sad medical arrangement. It was an impenetrable legal barrier. Charles absolutely hadn't merely transferred massive responsibility to his son. He had brilliantly, ruthlessly blocked the exact office most highly likely to actively contest exactly how that responsibility would be used. Catherine looked quickly toward Anne. Anne gave absolutely no visible sign of surprise, but her profound stillness clearly revealed that she completely understood the massive scale of exactly what had just happened. Charles had definitively chosen ironclad institutional certainty over fragile private peace, and he had done it permanently in his own unmistakable handwriting. That specific detail mattered immensely. Typed, formal language could easily be blamed later on overzealous advisors. Standard legal phrasing could easily be dismissed as mere routine. But a specific, handwritten sentence directly from the king himself absolutely could not be dismissed as a simple administrative misunderstanding. Charles signed his name heavily beneath the new sentence. Anne signed exactly beside it as the official witness. William placed his hand firmly on the document but didn't pick it up immediately. For a few heavy seconds, father and son remained entirely silent on opposite sides of the table, acutely aware that the single piece of paper between them had profoundly changed significantly more than just the royal diary. It had fundamentally changed the absolute center of global power. A secretary entered, silently sealed the copies, and asked exactly where the very first copy should be delivered. Charles answered entirely without hesitation, "Clarence House." Camilla received the devastating document before the public announcement was even fully drafted. She quickly turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and stopped dead. Then she immediately called for her senior staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace had ended. The massive fight over exactly what Charles had just signed was only just beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's staff fully expected explosive anger. What they saw instead was terrifying, icy control. She placed the copy of the order squarely on a table and coldly asked exactly each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. Absolutely no one spoke. The words were entirely too direct. They left absolutely no space for future negotiation, absolutely no quiet back-channel route back in on palace decisions, and absolutely no chance to ever falsely claim that William's massive authority remained dependent on her approval. Camilla asked sharply whether the devastating sentence could somehow be softened before the public announcement went live. Her top legal advisor answered incredibly carefully. The king had written it himself. The royal seal had been officially applied. Princess Anne had formally witnessed the signature. Absolutely any attempt to alter the wording now would require Charles to formally reopen the entire order. Camilla instantly understood the massive problem. Charles had slammed the door permanently shut before she could even reach it. Her private secretary nervously suggested that she appear prominently beside him on television anyway. A united, smiling image might successfully preserve the illusion of influence that the document had just stripped away. Camilla vehemently rejected the idea. Standing silently beneath palace cameras while William and Catherine were publicly presented as the absolute new center of the monarchy would look exactly like total consent. Worse, it would make her a humiliating public witness to her own explicit exclusion. She would absolutely not give them that triumphant picture. Across London, Buckingham Palace moved with incredibly unusual, frantic speed. Communications officers furiously drafted the final statement. Ceremonial staff meticulously measured camera positions in the Grand Throne Room. Security teams rapidly revised arrival plans. Government representatives in Westminster received a highly restricted notice that the king would briefly address the country regarding the future conduct of royal duties. The specific language was chosen with agonizing care. Charles was absolutely not abdicating. William was absolutely not being crowned king. Catherine was absolutely not being declared queen. Yet absolutely every practical detail pointed heavily toward the exact same undeniable reality. Absolute authority was moving. Massive public responsibility was moving. The incredible, visible weight of the crown was moving firmly with it. The official palace statement would politely call it continuity. The people in the room would accurately call it succession. Charles adamantly insisted on appearing first. His panicked advisors desperately wanted a simple written announcement released quietly through official channels, but he completely refused to let his illness speak for him. He would look directly into the cameras, clearly explain the difficult decision himself, and make it absolutely clear to the world that William had absolutely not demanded it. That specific point mattered to him significantly more than anyone realized. William had certainly spent years preparing to inherit the crown, but preparation was absolutely not the same thing as desire. Charles deeply knew exactly how quickly the fickle public could cruelly turn dutiful necessity into malicious ambition. One single photograph of William looking too eager near the throne, one poorly chosen phrase in a speech, one single suggestion that Catherine looked entirely too comfortable, and the necessary transition could instantly be recast by the tabloids as a ruthless family takeover. So, Charles would bravely carry the blame himself. He approved the short, somber address stating that his recovery required a massive reduction in duties. He would explicitly confirm that William was assuming total responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. He would explicitly name Catherine as the absolute person overseeing major ceremonial functions and the household's public program. Then, he added one final line the advisors had absolutely not prepared. The future must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows. Absolutely no one dared ask him to remove it. At Clarence House, Camilla received the final printed schedule for the broadcast. Her specific arrival time had been deliberately left blank. A physical place remained available near Charles during the opening statement if she chose to attend, but absolutely no speaking role had been assigned to her afterward. She could attend merely as his silent wife. She could absolutely not participate as a decision-maker. That specific distinction cut significantly deeper than absolutely any public insult ever could. Camilla sent exactly one final message to Buckingham Palace. She asked pointedly whether Charles would reconsider the restriction on her household if she agreed to appear beside him. The blunt reply came exactly 20 minutes later. The order stood exactly as signed. Camilla instantly canceled her waiting car outside Buckingham Palace. Broadcasters rapidly began live coverage. Massive crowds gathered anxiously beyond the iron gates. Newsrooms across the entire United Kingdom completely cleared their schedules. The very first live images showed senior officials entering quickly through a side entrance, closely followed by Anne, then William and Catherine. Camilla was glaringly missing. Wild rumors spread immediately across social media. Some confidently claimed sudden illness. Others accurately suggested a massive private disagreement. Palace officials stubbornly repeated the exact same useless phrase, a private family matter. Inside, Charles waited quietly in a private room with the original, signed order resting beside him. William arrived first. Catherine closely followed. Anne stood silently by the window, watching the massive courtyard below rapidly fill with television cameras. Charles looked incredibly tired, but his voice remained surprisingly steady. He told William that the impending announcement would permanently change the public understanding of their relationship. From that exact moment, absolutely every decision would be exhaustively examined for signs of conflict. Every single absence would instantly become a wild conspiracy theory. Every single appearance would be heavily treated as a formal declaration. William answered simply that he would honor the reign already in progress. Catherine said absolutely nothing. She was looking intently at the two massive ceremonial chairs positioned beyond the open doors. One bore William's place, the other bore hers. A breathless palace aide entered and finally confirmed that Camilla would absolutely not attend. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then gave the heavy order to begin. The cameras went live. The massive palace doors opened. And before Charles spoke a single word, all of Britain clearly saw exactly who had bravely chosen to stand beside the future, and exactly who had bitterly chosen to stay away. Charles entered the prepared room entirely alone. For several agonizing seconds, he stood heavily behind the lectern, entirely without speaking. The high-definition cameras had easily found the immense strain around his eyes. Absolutely no palace statement could possibly hide it. He looked fiercely determined, but the immense physical effort required to remain standing there was painfully visible. Then he began. He told the silent country that duty sometimes demanded a person recognize the massive difference between stubborn endurance and genuine service. Continuing at absolutely any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to dangerous uncertainty. His recovery strictly required massive distance from the daily, crushing weight of the crown, and the ancient institution required strong leadership that could act completely without hesitation. He explicitly named William. The words were highly measured, but their massive meaning traveled instantly through London, Westminster, and the frantic newsrooms following the address. William would fully assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the entire long-range direction of the royal household. The massive arrangement would begin absolutely immediately. Then Charles explicitly named Catherine. She would completely oversee massive state banquets, all diplomatic receptions, key ceremonial presentation, and the entire public program attached to the crown. Her massive role would absolutely not be merely decorative. She would firmly stand beside William whenever the monarchy desperately needed to show the country exactly who now carried its massive public burden. The room remained incredibly silent. Charles did absolutely not mention Camilla once. That glaring omission struck significantly harder than absolutely any spoken criticism ever could have done. He warmly thanked those who had supported him during his grueling treatment. He spoke movingly of continuity, family, and the future. But the very woman who had stood beside him through his entire reign was glaringly absent from both the room and the massive transfer of authority. At Clarence House, Camilla watched the historic address with two terrified staff members. She absolutely did not speak when William's name was prominently announced. She absolutely did not move when Catherine's massive new responsibilities were explicitly listed. Only when Charles finished entirely without naming absolutely any continuing role for her did she finally reach for the copy of the order again. The handwritten sentence waited exactly near the royal seal. Absolutely nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped heavily away from the lectern. William entered purposefully through the side doors. He absolutely did not smile for the cameras. He approached his father, bowed his head deeply, and promised to honor the reign Charles had begun. The historic moment was incredibly carefully controlled. The raw emotion absolutely was not. Charles placed one trembling hand on William's arm and released it very quickly, almost exactly as though holding on any longer might reveal entirely too much. Catherine gracefully joined them a few steps later. She wore absolutely no crown, absolutely no sparkling tiara, and absolutely no symbol suggesting a celebration. Her incredibly serious expression carried the immense weight of the decision significantly more than any speech could. Anne watched silently from the edge of the room. She had seen countless constitutional moments presented as pageantry before. This was fundamentally different. There were absolutely no cheers inside the palace, absolutely no celebratory music, absolutely no sense of victory, only a fractured family desperately trying to turn a highly private collapse in medical confidence into a flawless public image of unbroken order. Then Charles left the room. The cameras remained active. William and Catherine slowly turned toward the grand throne room, exactly where the two massive ceremonial chairs had been positioned perfectly beneath the royal insignia. They began walking together incredibly slowly, ensuring enough time for absolutely every single broadcaster to capture the historic image across the entire United Kingdom. The immense symbolism was immediate and undeniable. This was absolutely not a formal coronation, but it looked exactly like the absolute beginning of something that could absolutely not easily be reversed. William stopped squarely before the first chair. Catherine stood perfectly beside the second. Neither sat down at once. For one suspended, historic moment, they remained standing, acutely aware that the entire country was actively watching them inherit massive responsibility long before it actually inherited a new monarch. Then William finally took his place. Catherine followed. The stunning pictures spread rapidly across television screens and phones within minutes. Excited commentators frantically debated whether the palace had completely crossed an invisible constitutional line. Fierce supporters described it as completely necessary stability. Cynical critics questioned exactly how temporary the massive transfer could possibly be when the entire ceremony had been explicitly designed to present William and Catherine as the monarchy's absolute new center. But one massive question dominated absolutely every broadcast. Where exactly was Camilla? Palace officials stubbornly repeated that her glaring absence concerned a private family matter. The vague phrase satisfied absolutely no one. Investigative reporters outside Buckingham Palace had already learned that her official car had been abruptly cancelled right before the address. Others quickly discovered that absolutely no future ceremonial role for her appeared anywhere in the extensive public briefing documents. The neat, official explanation began to rapidly unravel. Inside Clarence's house, Camilla ordered the television completely switched off. She had certainly expected Charles to significantly reduce his schedule. She had absolutely not expected him to make William's massive authority so visibly total in front of the entire world. She had certainly not expected Catherine to entirely assume massive duties Camilla firmly believed should remain securely attached to her own position. Her grand title had absolutely not been removed. Her actual influence had completely evaporated. After the heavy cameras left, a private secretary handed William the original, signed order, rather than the clean public copy. He examined the final page and noticed something incredibly significant he had completely missed during the tense meeting. Charles had deliberately placed the handwritten restriction entirely directly above the massive royal seal. Absolutely anyone attempting to legally challenge William would have to somehow pass that ironclad sentence before ever reaching the king's signature. It was absolutely not a mere afterthought. It was the entire point. William carried the original order into a significantly smaller audience room after the cameras had gone. The loud noise of the crowds outside Buckingham Palace continued, but the inside of the building felt completely emptied of ceremony. Charles was sitting quietly near the window. Catherine stood perfectly still beside a table covered with briefing papers. Anne remained silently by the door, firmly holding the second, sealed folder absolutely no one had yet discussed. William placed the order gently before his father. He asked exactly one question. Was the handwritten restriction truly necessary? Charles absolutely did not answer at once. He looked heavily at the sentence above the seal, the absolute one line that had completely transformed the sad medical arrangement into an impenetrable boundary. Then he finally admitted exactly what the sanitized public statement had left completely unsaid. His doctors had absolutely forced him to reduce the physical workload, but Camilla's aggressive private preparations for power had forced him to definitively decide exactly where authority ended. Without that specific, handwritten sentence, absolutely every single decision could have instantly become an endless, agonizing negotiation. A key appointment made by William could have been endlessly questioned and stalled by Clarence's house. A massive state banquet planned by Catherine could have been maliciously revised through back-channel private messages. A crucial ceremonial invitation could have been deliberately delayed until Charles was forced to personally intervene from his sickbed. The king would have officially stepped away in public while continuing to desperately settle petty, toxic disputes in private. That was absolutely not a recovery. That was exactly another form of exhausting captivity. Charles told William with immense sadness that he had spent entirely too many years foolishly believing personal loyalty could be safely balanced against institutional clarity. This time, there could absolutely be no blurred line, absolutely no rival court, absolutely no second power center operating through friendship, access, or old habit. William listened without interrupting. The fierce anger he had carried earlier began to slowly change into understanding. His father had absolutely not written the restriction specifically to maliciously embarrass Camilla. He had written it because he deeply, painfully knew exactly how incredibly quickly uncertainty could become absolute control. Catherine understood the massive cost significantly more quietly. Charles had fiercely protected their authority, but in doing so, he had violently exposed the massive fracture inside his own household to them. The public would see a highly careful, smooth transition. The family would permanently remember the bitter argument behind it, and finally move away from the door. She astutely said the handwritten sentence would be exhaustively studied for years because it explicitly revealed the exact moment Charles finally stopped trying to satisfy absolutely everyone. As king, he had definitively chosen exactly one absolute line of command. As a husband, he had painfully accepted the consequence of that choice. At Clarence House, Camilla was reaching the exact same devastating conclusion. Her grand title definitely remained, her massive staff remained, her luxurious rooms, engagements, and private charities remained, yet the actual grinding machinery that gave absolutely all those things real influence had completely shifted away from her. All massive decisions would now firmly leave William's office. All major ceremonial instructions would strictly carry Catherine's approval. Desperate appeals to Charles would absolutely no longer reopen exactly what had been definitively settled by his heir. Camilla had absolutely not lost everything. She had completely lost the absolute only part that truly mattered most, the ability to actively shape exactly what happened next. By evening, the incredibly powerful image of William and Catherine standing firmly beneath the royal insignia had traveled massively across Britain and the world. Fierce supporters enthusiastically called it necessary stability. Cynical critics accurately called it a soft transfer of power. Palace officials completely refused both descriptions. They stubbornly repeated that Charles definitely remained king and that the massive arrangement merely protected continuity, but powerful symbols speak incredibly loudly when official statements refuse to. Exactly 2 chairs had been prepared, exactly 2 names had been announced, exactly 1 household had been completely excluded. Charles asked William for exactly 1 final massive promise. The difficult transition absolutely must not become a vicious campaign against Camilla. Absolutely no public retaliation, absolutely no deliberate humiliation, absolutely no coordinated attempt to completely erase her from the history of his reign. William solemnly agreed, but the promise carried an absolute limit. Respect would absolutely not mean surrendering his new authority. Catherine entirely supported that hard line. Camilla would be treated with absolute public dignity, but she would absolutely not be permitted to aggressively reopen decisions through private, back-channel pressure. That was the final settlement. Cold, incredibly clear, absolute final. Anne then silently stepped forward and placed the second, sealed folder directly on the table. Charles looked at it with immense dread and asked quietly whether it could possibly wait. Anne firmly said it absolutely could not. The cover carried an incredibly dry, short title, Queen's Household Privileges and Residences After the Transition. Inside were explosive, detailed instructions concerning her staff access, massive ceremonial invitations, and the specific royal properties Camilla could actually continue using while Charles remained away from public life. One highly specific page concerned Clarence House, another concerned her access to Buckingham Palace, but the final, devastating page carried a specific, handwritten note directly beside Camilla's name. It explicitly identified the exact, immovable date her unrestricted palace access could completely end, and it had incredibly been approved long before the throne room announcement even began. Camilla absolutely had not seen it yet. William absolutely had not seen it yet. And when Anne slowly opened that final page, even Charles appeared completely unprepared for exactly what had already been coldly authorized. The decision carried a massive, terrifying deadline measured absolutely not in years but in mere days. That specific, explosive document and the absolute single, historic residence Camilla could be forcefully ordered to leave first is exactly where the very next chapter of this incredible story begins.